Chapter 19. Never again. And now in age I bud again. After so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain. And relish versing. O my only light! It cannot be that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. Herbert. I shall inevitably be asked for a word of mature judgment of the expedition of a kind that was impossible when we were all close up to it, and when I was a subaltern of 24. Not incapable of judging my elders, but too young to have found out whether my judgment was worth anything. I now see very plainly that though we achieved a first-rate tragedy, which will never be forgotten just because it was a tragedy, tragedy was not our business. In the broad perspective opened up by 10 years' distance, I see not one journey to the pole, but two, in startling contrast one to another. On the one hand, Amundsen going straight there, getting there first, and returning without the loss of a single man. And without having put any greater strain on himself and his men than was all in the day's work of polar exploration. Nothing more businesslike could be imagined. On the other hand, our expedition, running appalling risks, performing prodigies of superhuman endurance, achieving immortal renown, commemorated in august cathedral sermons and by public statues. Yet reaching the pole only to find our terrible journey superfluous, and leaving our best men dead on the ice. To ignore such a contrast would be ridiculous, to write a book without accounting for it a waste of time. First let me do full justice to Amundsen. I have not attempted to disguise how we felt towards him when, after leading us to believe that he had equipped the Fram for an Arctic journey, and sailed for the north, he suddenly made his dash for the south. Nothing makes a more unpleasant impression than a feint. But when Scott reached the pole only to find that Amundsen had been there a month before him, his distress was not that of a schoolboy who has lost a race. I have described what it had cost Scott and his 4 companions to get to the pole, and what they had still to suffer in returning until death stopped them. Much of that risk and racking toil had been undertaken that men might learn what the world is like at the spot where the sun does not decline in the heavens. Where a man loses his orbit and turns like a joint on a spit, and where his face, however he turns, is always to the north. The moment Scott saw the Norwegian tent he knew that he had nothing to tell that was not already known. His achievement was a mere precaution against Amundsen perishing on his way back. And that risk was no greater than his own. The polar journey was literally laid waste, that was the shock that staggered them. Well might Bowers be glad to see the last of Norski's tracks as their homeward paths diverged. All this heartsickness has passed away now, and the future explorer will not concern himself with it. He will ask, what was the secret of Amundsen's slick success? What is the moral of our troubles and losses? I will take Amundsen's success first. Undoubtedly the very remarkable qualities of the man himself had a good deal to do with it. There is a sort of sagacity that constitutes the specific genius of the explorer. And Amundsen proved his possession of this by his guess that there was terra firma in the Bay of Whales as solid as on Ross Island. Then there is the quality of big leadership which is shown by daring to take a big chance. Amundsen took a very big one indeed when he turned from the route to the pole explored and ascertained by Scott and Shackleton and determined to find a second pass over the mountains from the barrier to the plateau. As it happened, he succeeded, and established his route as the best way to the pole until a better is discovered. But he might easily have failed and perished in the attempt. And the combination of reasoning and daring that nerved him to make it can hardly be overrated. All these things helped him. Yet any rather conservative whaling captain might have refused to make Scott's experiment with motor transport, ponies and man-hauling, and stuck to the dogs. And to the use of ski in running those dogs. And it was this quite commonplace choice that sent Amundsen so gaily to the pole and back, with no abnormal strain on men or dogs, and no great hardship either. He never pulled a mile from start to finish. The very ease of the exploit makes it impossible to infer from it that Amundsen's expedition was more highly endowed in personal qualities than ours. We did not suffer from too little brains or daring, we may have suffered from too much. We were primarily a great scientific expedition, with the pole as our bait for public support, though it was not more important than any other acre of the plateau. We followed in the steps of a polar expedition which brought back more results than any of its forerunners, Scott's Discovery voyage. We had the largest and most efficient scientific staff that ever left England. We were discursive. We were full of intellectual interests and curiosities of all kinds. We took on the work of 2 or 3 expeditions. It is obvious that there are disadvantages in such a division of energy. Scott wanted to reach the pole, a dangerous and laborious exploit, but a practicable one. Wilson wanted to obtain the egg of the emperor penguin, a horribly dangerous and inhumanly exhausting feat which is none the less impracticable because the 3 men who achieved it survived by a miracle. These 2 feats had to be piled one on top of the other. What with the depot journey and others, in addition to these 2, we were sledged out by the end of our second sledging season, and our worst year was still to come. We, the survivors, went in search of the dead when there was a possibly living party waiting in the ice somewhere for us to succor them. That turned out all right, because when we got back, we found Campbell's party self-extricated and waiting for us, alive and well. But suppose they also had perished, what would have been said of us? The practical man of the world has plenty of criticism of the way things were done. He says dogs should have been taken, but he does not show how they could have been got up and down the Beardmore. He is scandalized because 30 pounds of geological specimens were deliberately added to the weight of the sledge that was dragging the life out of the men who had to haul it. But he does not realize that it is the friction surfaces of the snow on the runners which mattered and not the dead weight, which in this case was almost negligible. Nor does he know that these same specimens dated a continent and may elucidate the whole history of plant life. He will admit that we were all very wonderful, very heroic, very beautiful and devoted, that our exploits gave a glamour to our expedition that Amundsen's cannot claim. But he has no patience with us, and declares that Amundsen was perfectly right in refusing to allow science to use up the forces of his men, or to interfere for a moment with his single business of getting to the pole and back again. No doubt he was, but we were not out for a single business, we were out for everything we could add to the world's store of knowledge about the Antarctic. Of course the whole business simply bristles with ifs. If Scott had taken dogs and succeeded in getting them up the Beardmore, if we had not lost those ponies on the depot journey, if the dogs had not been taken so far and the 1-ton depot had been laid, if a pony and some extra oil had been depoted on the barrier, if a 4-man party had been taken to the pole, if I had disobeyed my instructions and gone on from 1 ton, killing dogs as necessary, or even if I had just gone on a few miles and left some food and fuel under a flag upon a cairn, if they had been first at the pole, if it had been any other season but that. But always the bare fact remains that Scott could not have traveled from McMurdo Sound to the pole faster than he did except with dogs. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not have done it. Why, then, says the practical man, did we go to McMurdo Sound instead of to the Bay of Whales? Because we gained that continuity of scientific observation which is so important in this work, and because the Sound was the starting point for continuing the exploration of the only ascertained route to the pole, via the Beardmore Glacier. I am afraid it was all inevitable. We were as wise as anyone can be before the event. I admit that we, scrupulously economical of our pemmican, were terribly prodigal of our manpower. But we had to be. The draft, whatever it may have been on the whole, was not excessive at any given point, and anyhow we just had to use every man to take every opportunity. There is so much to do, and the opportunities for doing it are so rare. Generally speaking, I don't see how we could have done differently, but I don't want to see it done again. I don't want it to be necessary to do it again. I want to see this country tackle the job, and send enough men to do one thing at a time. They do it in Canada, why not in England too? But we wasted our manpower in one way which could have been avoided. I have described how every emergency was met by calling for volunteers, and how the volunteers were always forthcoming. Unfortunately, volunteering was relied on not only for emergencies, but for a good deal of everyday work that should have been organized as routine. And the inevitable result was that the willing horses were overworked. It was a point of honor not to see a canny. Men were allowed to do too much, and were told afterwards that they had done too much, and that is not discipline. They should not have been allowed to do too much. Until our last year we never insisted on a regular routine. Money was scarce. Probably Scott could not have obtained the funds for the expedition if its objective had not been the pole. There was no lack of the things which could be bought across the counter from big business houses, all landing, sledging, and scientific equipment was first class, but one of the first and most important items, the ship, would have sent Columbus on strike, and nearly sent us to the bottom of the sea. People talk of the niggardly equipment of Columbus when he sailed west from the Canaries to try a shortcut to an inhabited continent of magnificent empires, as he thought. But his 3 ships were, relatively to the resources of that time, much better than the one old tramp in which we sailed for a desert of ice in which the evening and morning are the year and not the day, and in which not even polar bears and reindeers can live. Amundsen had the Fram, built for polar exploration ad hoc. Scott had the Discovery. But when one thinks of these Nimrods and Terra Novas, picked up second-hand in the wooden ship market, and faked up for the transport of ponies, dogs, motors, and all the impedimenta of a polar expedition, to say nothing of the men who have to try and do scientific work inside them, one feels disposed to clamor for a Polar Factory Act making it a crime to ship men for the ice in vessels more fit to ply between London Bridge and Ramsgate. And then the begging that is necessary to obtain even this equipment. Shackleton hanging round the doors of rich men. Scott writing begging letters for months together. Is the country not ashamed? Modern civilized states should make up their minds to the endowment of research, which includes exploration. And as all states benefit alike by the scientific side of it, there is plenty of scope for international arrangement, especially in a region where the mere grabbing of territory is meaningless. And no foreign office can trace the frontier between King Edward's Plateau and King Hawkins. The Antarctic continent is still mostly unexplored, but enough is known of it to put any settlement by ordinary pioneer emigration, Pilgrim Fathers, and the like, out of the question. Ross Island is not a place for a settlement, it is a place for an elaborately equipped scientific station, with a staff in residence for a year at a time. Our stay of 3 years was far too much, another year would have driven the best of us mad. Of the 5 main journeys which fell to my lot, 1, the winter journey, should not have been undertaken at all with our equipment. And 2 others, the dog journey and the search journey, had better have been done by fresh men. It is no use repeating that Englishmen will respond to every call and stick it to the death. They will, some of them, but they have to pay the price all the same. And the price in my case was an overdraft on my vital capital which I shall never quite pay off, and in the case of 5 bigger, stronger, more seasoned men, death. The establishment of such stations and of such a service cannot be done by individual heroes and enthusiasts cadging for checks from rich men and grants from private scientific societies. It is a business. Like the Nares Arctic expedition, for public organization. I do not suppose that in these days of aviation the next visit to the pole will be made by men on foot dragging sledges, or by men on sledges dragged by dogs, mules or ponies. Nor will depots be laid in that way. The pack will not, I hope, be broken through by any old coal-burning ship that can be picked up in the second-hand market. Specially built ships, and enough of them, specially engined tractors and aeroplanes, specially trained men and plenty of them, will all be needed if the work is to be done in any sort of humane and civilized fashion. And cabinet ministers and voters alike must learn to value knowledge that is not baited by suffering and death. My own bolt is shot. I do not suppose I shall ever go south again before I go west. But if I do it will be under proper and reasonable conditions. I may not come back a hero, but I shall come back none the worse. For I repeat, the Antarctic, in moderation as to length of stay, and with such accommodation as is now easily within the means of modern civilized powers, is not half as bad a place for public service as the worst military stations on the equator. I hope that by the time Scott comes home, for he is coming home, the barrier is moving. And not a trace of our funeral cairn was found by Shackleton's men in 1916, the hardships that wasted his life will be only a horror of the past. And his Via Dolorosa a highway as practicable as Piccadilly. And now let me come down to tin tacks. No matter how well the thing is done in future, its organizers will want to know at first all we can tell them about oil, about cold, and about food. First, as to oil. Scott complains of a shortage of oil at several of his last depots. There is no doubt that this shortage was due to the perishing of the leather washers of the tins which contained the paraffin oil. All these tins had been subjected to the warmth of the sun in summer and the autumn temperatures, which were unexpectedly cold. In his Voyage of the Discovery, Scott wrote as follows of the tins in which they drew their oil when sledging. Each tin had a small cork bung, which was a decided weakness. Paraffin creeps in the most annoying manner, and a good deal of oil was wasted in this way, especially when the sledges were traveling over rough ground and were shaken or, as frequently happened, capsized. It was impossible to make these bungs quite tight, however closely they were jammed down, so that in spite of a trifling extra weight a much better fitting would have been a metallic screwed bung. To find on opening a fresh tin of oil that it was only 3 parts full was very distressing, and of course meant that the cooker had to be used with still greater care. 349 Amundsen wrote of his paraffin, "We kept it in the usual cans but they proved too weak, not that we lost any paraffin, but Bjaaland had to be constantly soldering to keep them tight." 350. Our own tins were furnished with the metallic screwed stoppers which Scott recommended. There was no trouble reported 351 until we came up to 1 Ton Camp when on the search journey. Here was the depot of food and oil which I had laid in the previous autumn for the polar party, stowed in a canvas tank which was buried beneath 7 feet of snow. The oil was placed on the top of the snow, in order that the red tins might prove an additional mark for the depot. When we dug out the tank, the food inside was almost uneatable owing to the quantity of paraffin which had found its way down through 7 feet of snow during the winter and spring. We then found the polar party and learned of the shortage of oil. After our return to Cape Evans, someone was digging about the camp and came across a wooden case containing 8 one-gallon tins of paraffin. These had been placed there in September 1911, to be landed at Cape Crozier by the Terra Nova when she came down. The ship could not take them, they were snowed up during the winter, lost and forgotten, until dug up 15 months afterwards. 3 tins were full, 3 empty, 1 1/3 full and 1 2/3 full. There can be no doubt that the oil, which was specially volatile, tended to vaporize and escape through the stoppers, and that this process was accelerated by the perishing. And I suggest also the hardening and shrinking of the leather washers. Another expedition will have to be very careful on this point. They might reduce the risk by burying the oil. The second point about which something must be said is the unexpected cold met by Scott on the barrier, which was the immediate cause of the disaster. No one in the world would have expected the temperatures and surfaces which we encountered at this time of the year. It is clear that these circumstances come on very suddenly, and our wreck is certainly due to this sudden advent of severe weather, which does not seem to have any satisfactory cause. 352. They came down the glacier in plus temperatures, nor was there anything abnormal for more than a week after they got on to the barrier. Then there came a big drop to a -37° minimum on the night of February 26. It is significant that the sun began to dip below the southern horizon at midnight about this time. There is no doubt the middle of the barrier is a pretty awful locality, wrote Scott. Simpson, in his meteorological report, has little doubt that the temperatures met by the polar party were abnormal. The records clearly bring to light the possibility of great cold at an extremely early period in the year within a comparatively few miles of an open sea where the temperatures were over 40 degrees higher. It is quite impossible to believe that normally there is a difference of nearly 40 degrees in March between McMurdo Sound and the south of the barrier. The temperatures recorded by other sledge parties in March 1912 and those recorded at Cape Evans form additional evidence, in Simpson's opinion, that the temperatures experienced by Scott were not such as might be expected during normal autumn weather. Simpson's explanation is based upon the observations made in McMurdo Sound by sending up balloons with self-recording instruments attached. These showed that very rapid radiation takes place from the snow surface in winter, which cools the air in the immediate neighborhood. A cold layer of air is thus formed near the ground, which may be many degrees colder than the air above it. It becomes, as it were, colder than it ought to be. This, however, can only happen during an absence of wind. When a wind blows, the cold layer is swept away, the air is mixed and the temperature rises. The absence of wind from the south noted by Scott was, in Simpson's opinion, the cause of the low temperatures met by Scott. The temperature was reduced 10 degrees below normal at Cape Evans, and perhaps 20 degrees where Scott was. 353. The third question is that of food. It is this point which is most important to future explorers. It is a fact that the Polar Party failed to make their distance because they became weak, and that they became weak although they were eating their full ration or more than their full ration of food, save for a few days when they went short on the way down the Beardmore Glacier. The first man to weaken was the biggest and heaviest man in the expedition, the man whom we had least expected to fail. The rations were of two kinds. The barrier, B, ration was that which was used on the barrier during the outward journey towards the pole. The summit, S, ration was the result of our experiments on the winter journey. I expect it is the best ration which has been used to date, and consisted of biscuit 16, pemmican 12, butter 2, cocoa 0.57, sugar 3 and tea 0.86 ounces, total 34.43 ounces daily per man. The 12 men who went forward started this S ration at the foot of the Beardmore, and it was this ration which was left in all depots to see them home. It was much more satisfying than the barrier ration. And men could not have eaten so much when leading ponies or driving dogs in the early stages of summer barrier sledging, but man-hauling is a different business altogether from leading ponies or driving dogs. It is calculated that the body requires certain proportions of fat, carbohydrates and proteins to do certain work under certain conditions, but just what the absolute quantities are is not ascertained. The work of the Polar Party was laborious. The temperatures, the most important of the conditions, varied from comparative warmth up and down the glacier to an average of about -20 degrees in the rarefied air of the plateau. The temperatures met by them on their return over the barrier were not really low for more than a week. And then there came quite commonly -30s during the day with a further drop to -40s at night, when for a time the sun was below the horizon. These temperatures, which are not very terrible to men who are fresh and whose clothing is new, were ghastly to these men who had striven night and day almost ceaselessly for 4 months on. As I maintain, insufficient food. Did these temperatures kill them? Undoubtedly the low temperatures caused their death, inasmuch as they would have lived had the temperatures remained high. But Evans would not have lived, he died before the low temperatures occurred. What killed Evans? And why did the other men weaken as they did, though they were eating full rations and more? Weakened so much that in the end they starved to death. I have always had a doubt whether the weather conditions were sufficient to cause the tragedy. These men on full rations were supposed to be eating food of sufficient value to enable them to do the work they were doing, under the conditions which they actually met until the end of February, without loss of strength. They had more than their full rations. But the conditions in March were much worse than they imagined to be possible. When 3 survivors out of the 5 pitched their last camp they were in a terrible state. After the war I found that Atkinson had come to wonder much as I, but he had gone farther. For he had the values of our rations worked out by a chemical expert according to the latest knowledge and standards. I may add that, being in command after Scott's death, he increased the ration for the next year's sledging. So I suppose he had already come to the conclusion that the previous ration was not sufficient. The following are some of the data for which I am indebted to him. The whole subject will be investigated by him and the results published in a more detailed form. According to the most modern standards, the food requirements for laborious work at a temperature of 0°F, which is a fair barrier average temperature to take, are 7,714 calories to produce 10,069 foot-tons of work. The actual barrier ration which we used would generate 4,003 calories, equivalent to 5,331 foot-tons of work. Similar requirements for laborious work at -10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a high average plateau temperature, are 8,500 calories to produce 11,094 foot-tons of work. The actual summit ration would generate 4,889 calories, equivalent to 6,608 foot-tons of work. These requirements are calculated for total absorption of all foodstuffs, but in practice, by visual proof, this does not take place. This is especially noticeable in the case of fats, a quantity of which were digested neither by men, ponies, nor dogs. Several things go to prove that our ration was not enough. In the first case, we were probably not as fit as we seemed after long sledge journeys. There is no doubt that when sledging, men developed an automaticity of certain muscles at the expense of other muscles. For instance, a sledge could be hauled all day at the expense of the arms. And we had little power to lift weights at the end of several months of sledging. In relation to this, I would add that, when the relief ship arrived in February 1912, 4 of us were at Cape Evans, but just arrived from 3 months of the polar journey. The land party, we 4 among them, were turned on to sledge stores ashore. This in practice meant 20 miles every day dragging a sledge. A good deal of humping heavy cases, from 5 o'clock in the morning to very late at night, with uncertain meals and no rests. I can remember now how hard that work was to myself and, I expect, to those others who had been away sledging. The ship's party sledged only every other day, because they were not used to it. This was extremely bad organization, and in view of the possibility that some of the men might be required for further sledging in the autumn, just silly. Again, there is the experience of the man-hauling parties of the polar journey. There was, you may remember, a man-hauling party on the way to the Beardmore Glacier. They traveled with a light sledge, but they lost weight on the barrier ration. It is significant that they picked up condition when they started the summit ration, especially Lashley. The polar party and the 2 returning parties, who were on the summit ration from the foot of the Beardmore until the end of their journeys, weakened, in Atkinson's opinion, more than they should have done had their ration been sufficient. The first return party covered approximately 1,100 statute miles. At the end of their journey, their pulling muscles were all right, but Atkinson, who led the party, considers that they were at least 70% weaker in other muscles. They all lost a great deal of weight, though they had the best conditions of the 3 returning parties, and the temperatures met by them averaged well over 0. The second return party faced much worse conditions. They were only 3 men, and one of the 3 was so sick that for 120 miles he could not pull, and for 90 miles he had to be dragged on the sledge. The average temperature approximated 0. They were extremely exhausted. Scott makes constant reference to the increasing hunger of the polar party. It is clear that the food did not compensate for the conditions which were met in increasing severity. Yet they were eating rather more than their full ration a considerable part of the time. It has to be considered that the temperatures met by them averaged far below -10 degrees, that they did not absorb all their food, that increased heat was wanted not only for energy to do extra work caused by bad surfaces and contrary winds, but also to heat their bodies, and to thaw out their clothing and sleeping bags. I believe it to be clear that the rations used by us must not only be increased by future expeditions, but coordinated in different proportions of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Taking into consideration the fact that our bodies were not digesting the amount of fats we had provided. Atkinson suggests that it is useless to increase the fats at the expense of the protein and carbohydrates. He recommends that fats should total about 5 ounces daily. The digestion of carbohydrates is easy and complete, and though that of protein is more complicated, there are plenty of the necessary digestive ferments. The ration should be increased by equal amounts of protein and carbohydrates. Both should be provided in as dry and pure a form as possible. There is no censure attached to this criticism. Our ration was probably the best which has been used, but more is known now than was known then. We are all out to try and get these things right for the future. 354. Campbell reached Hut Point only 5 days after we left it with the dog teams. A characteristic note left to greet us on our return regretted they were too late to take part in the search journey. If I had lived through 10 months such as those men had just endured, wild horses would not have dragged me out sledging again. But they were keen to get some useful work done in the time which remained until the ship arrived. We had the polar records. Campbell and his men, unaided, had not only survived their terrible winter, but had sledged down the coast after it. We ourselves, faced by a difficult alternative, had fallen on our feet. We never hoped for more than this, we seldom hoped for so much. I wanted a series of Adelie penguin embryos from the rookery at Cape Royds, but had not expected an opportunity of getting them because I was away sledging during the summer months. Now the chance had come. Atkinson wanted to work on parasites at the same place, and others to survey. But the real job was an ascent of Erebus, the active volcano which rose from our doors to some 13,400 feet in height. A party of Shackleton's men under Professor David went up it in March, and managed to haul a sledge up to 5,800 feet, from which point they had to portage their gear. A year before this Debenham, with the help of a telescope, selected a route by which they could haul a sledge up to 9,000 feet. There proved to be no great difficulty about it. It was just a matter of legs and breath. They were a cheery company, part singing in the evenings and working hard all day. It was an uneventful trip, Debenham said, and very harmonious, the best trip he had down there. Both Debenham and Dickason suffered from mountain sickness, however, and they were the two smokers. The clearness of the air was marked. At 5,000 feet they could plainly see Mount Melbourne and Cape Jones, between 200 and 300 miles away, and several uncharted mountains over to the west. But they were unable to plot them accurately because they could get direction rays from one point only. The Sound itself was covered by cloud most of the time, but Beaufort Island and Franklin Island were clear. Unlike David's party, they could see no signs whatever of volcanic action on Mount Bird, which is almost entirely covered with ice on which it was to be expected that some mark might be left. At 9,000 feet Terra looked very imposing, but Mount Bird and Terra Nova were insignificant and uninteresting. The valley between the old crater and the slopes of the second crater greatly impressed them, and they found a fine little crevassed glacier in it. Both Priestley and Debenham are of opinion that it is possible to get to Terra by this valley, and that there are no crevassed areas or impossible slopes on the way. All the same, it would probably be more sensible to go from Cape Crozier. At a point about 9,000 feet up, Priestley, Gran, Abbott and Hooper started to make the ascent to the active crater on December 10. They packed the tent, poles, bags, inner cooker and cooking gear, with 4 days' provisions, and reached the second crater at about 11,500 feet, to be hung up by cloud all the next day. At these altitudes the temperature varied between -10 degrees and -30 degrees, though at sea level simultaneously they were round about freezing point. By 1 a.m. on the 12th the conditions were good, clear, with a southerly wind blowing the steam away from the summit. The party got away as soon as possible and reached the lip of the active crater in a few hours. Looking down they were unable to see the bottom, for it was full of steam. The sides sloped at a steep angle for some 500 feet, when they became sheer precipices. The opening appeared to be about 14,000 paces round. The top is mostly pumice, but there is also a lot of conite, much the same as at sea level. The old crater was mostly conite. Proving that this is the oldest rock of the island, felspar crystals must be continually thrown out, for they were lying about on the top of the snow. I have one nearly 3½ inches long. 2 men went back to the camp, for one had a frostbitten foot. This left Priestley and Gran, who tried to boil the hypsometer but failed owing to the wind, which was variable and enveloped them from time to time in steam and sulfur vapor. They left a record on a cairn and started to return. But when they had got 500 feet down, Priestley found that he had left a tin of exposed films on the top instead of the record. Gran said he would go back and change it. He had reached the top when there was a loud explosion. Large blocks of pumice were hurled out with a big smoke cloud, probably a big bubble had burst. Gran was in the middle of it, heard it gurgle before it burst, saw blocks of pumiceous lava, in shape like the halves of volcanic bombs, and with bunches of long, drawn-out, hair-like shreds of glass in their interior. 355 This was Pellé's hair. Gran was a bit sick from sulfur dioxide fumes afterwards. They reached Cape Royds on the 16th, the very successful trip taking 15 days. Meanwhile, Shackleton's old hut was very pleasant at this time of year. In winter it was a bit too draughty. With bright sunlight, a lop on the sea which splashed and gurgled under the ice foot, the beautiful mountains all round us, and the penguins nesting at our door. This was better than the Beardmore Glacier, where we had expected to be at this date. What then must it have been to the 6 men who were just returned from the very gate of hell? And the food, truly Shackleton's men must have fed like turkey cocks from all the delicacies here, boiled chicken, kidneys, mushrooms, ginger, Garibaldi biscuits. Soups of all kinds. It is a splendid change. Best of all are the fresh buttered skuas eggs which we make for breakfast. In fact, life is bearable with all that has been unknown so long at last cleared up, and our anxieties for Campbell's party laid at rest. 356. For 3 weeks I worked among the Adelie penguins at Cape Royds, and obtained a complete series of their embryos. It was always Wilson's idea that embryology was the next job of a vertebral zoologist down south. I have already explained that the penguin is an interesting link in the evolutionary chain, and the object of getting this embryo is to find out where the penguins come in. 357 Whether or no they are more primitive than other non-flying birds, such as the apteryx, the ostrich, the rhea and the moa, which last is only just extinct, is an open question. But wingless birds are still hanging on to the promontories of the southern continents, where there is less rivalry than in the highly populated land areas of the north. It may be that penguins are descended from ancestors who lived in the northern hemisphere in a winged condition. Even now you may sometimes see them try to fly. And that they have been driven towards the south. If penguins are primitive, it is rational to infer that the most primitive penguin is farthest south. These are the 2 Antarcticists, the Emperor and the Adelie. The latter appears to be the more numerous and successful of the 2, and for this reason we are inclined to search among the emperors as being among the most primitive penguins. If not the most primitive of birds now living, hence the winter journey. I was glad to get, in addition, this series of Adelie penguins' embryos, feeling somewhat like a giant who had wandered on to the wrong planet, and who was distinctly in the way of its true inhabitants. We returned too late to see the eggs laid, and therefore it was impossible to tell how old the embryos were. My hopes rose, however, when I saw some eggless nests with penguins sitting upon them, but later I found that these were used as bachelor quarters by birds whose wives were sitting near. I tried taking eggs from nests and was delighted to find that new eggs appeared. These I carefully marked. And it was not until I opened one 2 days later to find inside an embryo at least 2 weeks old, that I realized that penguins added baby snatching to their other immoralities. Some of those from whom I took eggs sat upon stones of a similar size and shape with every appearance of content. One sat upon the half of the red tin of a Dutch cheese. They are not very intelligent. All the world loves a penguin. I think it is because in many respects they are like ourselves, and in some respects what we should like to be. Had we but half their physical courage, none could stand against us. Had we 100th part of their maternal instinct, we should have to kill our children by the 1,000. Their little bodies are so full of curiosity that they have no room for fear. They like mountaineering and joyriding on ice floes. They even like to drill. One day there had been a blizzard, and lying open to the view of all was a deserted nest, a pile of coveted stones. All the surrounding rookery made their way to and fro, each husband acquiring merit, for, after each journey, he gave his wife a stone. This was the plebeian way of doing things. But my friend who stood, ever so unconcerned, upon a rock knew a trick worth two of that, he and his wife who sat so cozily upon the other side. The victim was a third penguin. He was without a mate, but this was an opportunity to get one. With all the speed his little legs could compass he ran to and fro, taking stones from the deserted nest, laying them beneath a rock, and hurrying back for more. On that same rock was my friend. When the victim came up with his stone he had his back turned. But as soon as the stone was laid and the other gone for more, he jumped down, seized it with his beak, ran round, gave it to his wife and was back on the rock, with his back turned, before you could say killer whale. Every now and then he looked over his shoulder, to see where the next stone might be. I watched this for 20 minutes. All that time, and I do not know for how long before, that wretched bird was bringing stone after stone. And there were no stones there. Once he looked puzzled, looked up and swore at the back of my friend on his rock, but immediately he came back, and he never seemed to think he had better stop. It was getting cold and I went away, he was coming for another. The life of an Adelie penguin is one of the most unchristian and successful in the world. The penguin which went in for being a true believer would never stand the ghost of a chance. Watch them go to bathe. Some 50 or 60 agitated birds are gathered upon the ice foot, peering over the edge, telling one another how nice it will be, and what a good dinner they are going to have. But this is all swank, they are really worried by a horrid suspicion that a sea leopard is waiting to eat the first to dive. The really noble bird, according to our theories, would say, I will go first and if I am killed I shall at any rate have died unselfishly, sacrificing my life for my companions. And in time all the most noble birds would be dead. What they really do is to try and persuade a companion of weaker mind to plunge. Failing this, they hastily pass a conscription act and push him over. And then, bang, helter-skelter, in go all the rest. They take turns in sitting on their eggs, and after many days the fathers may be seen waddling down towards the sea with their shirt-fronts muddied, their long trick done. It may be a fortnight before they return, well-fed, clean, pleased with life, and with a grim determination to relieve their wives, to do their job. Sometimes they are met by others going to bathe. They stop and pass the time of day. Well, perhaps it would be more pleasant, and what does a day or two matter anyhow? They turn, clean and dirty alike are off to the seaside again. This is when they say, the women are splendid. Life is too strenuous for them to have any use for the virtues of brotherly love, good works, charity and benevolence. When they mate the best thief wins, when they nest the best pair of thieves hatch out their eggs. In a long unbroken stream, which stretches down below the sea ice horizon, they march in from the open sea. Some are walking on their human feet, others tobogganing upon their shiny white breasts. After their long walk they must have a sleep, and then the gentlemen make their way into the already crowded rookery to find them wives. But first a suitor must find, or steal, a pebble, for such are the penguin jewels, they are of lava, black, russet or grey, with almond-shaped crystals bedded in them. They are rare and of all sizes, but that which is most valued is the size of a pigeon's egg. Armed with one of these he courts his maid, laying it at her feet. If accepted he steals still more stones, she guards them jealously, taking in the meantime any safe opportunity to pick others from under her nearest neighbors. Any penguin which is unable to fight and steal successfully fails to make a good high nest, or loses it when made. Then comes a blizzard, and after that a thaw, for it thaws sometimes right down by the seashore where the Adelies have their nurseries. The eggs of the strong and wicked hatch out, but those of the weak are addled. You must have a jolly good pile of stones to hatch eggs after a blizzard like that in December 1911, when the rookeries were completely snow-covered, nests, eggs, parents and all. Once hatched, the chicks grow quickly from pretty gray atoms of down to black lumps of stomach topped by a small and quite inadequate head. They are 2 or more weeks old, and they leave their parents, or their parents leave them, I do not know which. If socialism be the nationalization of the means of production and distribution, then they are socialists. They divide into parents and children. The adult community comes up from the open sea, bringing food inside them. They are full of half-digested shrimps. But not for their own children. These, if not already dead, are lost in a crowd of hungry tottering infants which besiege each food provider as he arrives. But not all of them can get food, though all of them are hungry. Some have already been behindhand too long, they have not managed to secure food for days, and they are weak and cold and very weary. As we stood there and watched this race for food, we were gradually possessed with the idea that the chicks looked upon each adult coming up full-bellied from the shore as not a parent only, but a food supply. The parents were laboring under a totally different idea, and intended either to find their own infants and feed them, or else to assimilate their already partially digested catch themselves. The more robust of the young thus worried an adult until, because of his importunity, he was fed. But with the less robust a much more pathetic ending was the rule. A chick that had fallen behind in this literal race for life, starving and weak, and getting daily weaker because it could not run fast enough to insist on being fed. Again and again ran off pursuing with the rest. Again and again it stumbled and fell, persistently whining out its hunger in a shrill and melancholy pipe, till at last the race was given up. Forced thus by sheer exhaustion to stop and rest, it had no chance of getting food. Each hurrying parent with its little following of hungry chicks, intent on one thing only, rushed quickly by, and the starveling dropped behind to gather strength for one more effort. Again it fails, a robuster bird has forced the pace, and again success is wanting to the runt. Sleepily it stands there, with half-shut eyes, in a torpor resulting from exhaustion, cold, and hunger, wondering perhaps what all the bustle round it means, a little dirty, disheveled dot. In the race for life a failure, deserted by its parents, who have hunted vainly for their own offspring round the nest in which they hatched it, but from which it may by now have wandered half a mile. And so it stands, lost to everything around, till a skua in its beat drops down beside it, and with a few strong, vicious pecks puts an end to the failing life. 358. There is a great deal to be said for this kind of treatment. The Adelie penguin has a hard life, the emperor penguin a horrible one. Why not kill off the unfit right away, before they have had time to breed, almost before they have had time to eat? Life is a stern business in any case, why pretend that it is anything else? Or that any but the best can survive at all? And in consequence, I challenge you to find a more jolly, happy, healthy lot of old gentlemen in the world. We must admire them, if only because they are so much nicer than ourselves. But it is grim, nature is an uncompromising nurse. Nature was going to give us a bad time too if we were not relieved, and on January 17th, as there were still no signs of the ship, it was decided to prepare for another winter. We were to go on rations, to cook with oil, for nearly all the coal was gone, to kill and store up seal. On January 18th we started our preparations, digging a cave to store more meat, and so forth. I went off seal hunting after breakfast, and having killed and cut up 2, came back across the cape at midday. All the men were out working in the camp. There was nothing to be seen in the Sound, and then, quite suddenly, the bows of the ship came out from behind the end of the Barne Glacier, 2 or 3 miles away. We watched her cautious approach with immense relief. "Are you all well?" through a megaphone from the bridge. The polar party died on their return from the pole, we have their records. A pause and then a boat. Evans, who had been to England and made a good recovery from scurvy, was in command, with him were Pennell, Rennick, Bruce, Lilly and Drake. They reported having had a very big gale indeed on their way home last year. We got some apples off the ship, beauties, I want nothing better. Pennell is first class, as always. One notices among the ship's men a rather unnatural way of talking, not so much in special instances, but as a whole. Contact with civilization gives it an affected sound. I notice it in both officers and men. 359. January 19th. On board the Terra Nova. After 28 hours loading we left the old hut for good and all at 4 p.m. this afternoon. It has been a bit of a rush and little sleep last night. It is quite wonderful now to be traveling a day's journey in an hour. We went to Cape Royds in about that time and took off geological and zoological specimens. I should like to sit up and sketch all these views, which would have meant long traveling without the ship, but I feel very tired. The mail is almost too good for words. Now, with the latest waltz on the gramophone, beer for dinner and apples and fresh vegetables to eat, life is more bearable than it has been for many a long weary week and month. I leave Cape Evans with no regret. I never want to see the place again. The pleasant memories are all swallowed up in the bad ones. 360. Before the ship arrived it was decided among us to urge the erection of a cross on Observation Hill to the memory of the Polar Party. On the arrival of the ship the carpenter immediately set to work to make a great cross of Jarrah wood. There was some discussion as to the inscription, it being urged that there should be some quotation from the Bible because the women think a lot of these things. But I was glad to see the concluding line of Tennyson's Ulysses adopted, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. The open water stretched about 1.5 miles south of Tent Island, and here we left the ship to sledge the cross to Hut Point at 8 a.m. on January 20th. The party consisted of Atkinson, Wright, Lashley, Crean, Debenham, Cohane and Davies, the ship's carpenter and myself. Evening. Hut Point. We had a most unpleasant experience coming in. We struck wind and drift just about 1 mile from Hut Point, then we saw there was a small thaw pool off the point, and came out to give it a wide berth. Atkinson put his feet down into water, we turned sharp out, and then Crean went right in up to his arms, and we realized that the ice was not more than 3 or 4 inches of slush. I managed to give him a hand out without the ice giving, and we went on floundering about. Then Crean went right in again, and the sledge nearly went too. We pulled the sledge, and the sledge pulled him out. Except for some more soft patches that was all, but it was quite enough. I think we got out of it most fortunately. Crean got some dry clothes here, and the cross has had a coat of white paint and is drying. We went up Observation Hill and have found a good spot right on the top, and have already dug a hole which will, with the rock alongside, give us 3 feet. From there we can see that this year's old ice is in a terrible state, open water slush all over near the land. I have never seen anything like it here. Off Cape Armitage and at the Pram Point pressure it is extra bad. I only hope we can find a safe way back. You would not think Crean had had such a pair of duckings to hear him talking so merrily tonight. I really do think the cross is going to look fine. 361. Observation Hill was clearly the place for it, it knew them all so well. 3 of them were Discovery men who lived 3 years under its shadow, they had seen it time after time as they came back from hard journeys on the barrier. Observation Hill and Castle Rock were the 2 which always welcomed them in. It commanded McMurdo Sound on one side, where they had lived, and the barrier on the other, where they had died. No more fitting pedestal, a pedestal which in itself is nearly 1,000 feet high, could have been found. Tuesday, January 22nd. Rousing out at 6 a.m. We got the large piece of the cross up Observation Hill by 11 a.m. It was a heavy job, and the ice was looking very bad all round, and I for one was glad when we had got it up by 5 o'clock or so. It is really magnificent, and will be a permanent memorial which could be seen from the ship 9 miles off with a naked eye. It stands 9 feet out of the rocks, and many feet into the ground, and I do not believe it will ever move. When it was up, facing out over the barrier, we gave 3 cheers and 1 more. We got back to the ship all right and coasted up the western mountains to Granite Harbor, a wonderfully interesting trip to those of us who had only seen these mountains from a distance. Gran went off to pick up a depot of geological specimens. Lily did a trawl. This was an absorbing business, though it was only one of a long and important series made during the voyages of the Terra Nova. Here were all kinds of sponges, siliceous, glass rope, tubular, and they were generally covered with mucus. Some fed on diatoms so minute that they can only be collected by centrifuge, some have gastric juices to dissolve the siliceous skeletons of the diatoms on which they feed, they anchor themselves in the mud and pass water in and out of their bodies. Sometimes the current is stimulated by cilia. There were colonies of Gorgonacea, which share their food unselfishly, and corals and marine degenerate worms, which started to live in little cells like coral, but have gone down in the world. And there were starfishes, sea urchins, brittle stars, feather stars and sea cucumbers. The sea urchins are formed of hexagonal plates, the center of each of which is a ball, upon which a spine works on a ball and socket joint. These spines are used for protection, and when large they can be used for locomotion. But the real means of locomotion are 5 double rows of water tube feet, working by suction, by which they withdraw the water inside a receptacle in the shell, thereby forming a vacuum. Starfishes do the same. We found a species of sea urchin which had such large spines that they practically formed bars. The spines were twice as long as the sea urchin and shaped just like oars, being even fluted. A lobster grows by discarding his suit, hiding and getting another, growing meanwhile. A snail or an oyster retains his original shell, and adds to it in layers all the way down, increasing one edge. But our sea urchin grows by an increment of calcareous matter all round the outside of each plate. As the animal grows the plates get bigger. There was a sea cucumber which nurses its young, having a brood cavity which is really formed out of the mouth. This is a peculiarity of a new Antarctic genus found first on the Discovery. It has the most complex water tubes, which it uses as legs, and a few limy rods in its soft skin instead of the bony calcareous plates of sea urchins and starfish. After them came the feather stars, a relic of the old crinoids which used to flourish in the Carboniferous period, examples of which can be found in the Derbyshire limestone. And there were thousands of brittle stars, like beautiful wheels of which the hubs and spokes remained, but not the circumference. These spokes or legs are muscular, sensory and locomotive. They differ from the starfishes in that they have no digestive glands in their legs, and from the feather stars in that they do not use their legs to waft food into their mouths. Once upon a time they had a stalk and were anchored to a rock, and there are still very rare old stalked echinoderms living in the sea. This apparently geological thing was found by Wyville Thomson in 1868 still living in the seas to the north of Scotland. And this find started the Challenger expedition for deep-sea soundings in 1872. But the Challenger brought back little in this line. Most of the species we found were peculiar to the Antarctic. There were polychaete worms by the hundred, showing the protrusible mouth, which is shoved into the mud and then brought back into the body. And the bristles on the highly developed projections which act as legs, by which they get about the mud. These beasts have apparently given rise to the arthropods. In a modified and later form they had taken to living in a tube, both for protection and because they found that they could not go through the mud, which had become too viscous for them. So they stand up in a tube and collect the sediment which is falling by means of tentacles. They spread from one locality to another by going through a plankton embryonic stage in their youth. They may be compared to the mason worms, which also build tubes. But as Lily squatted on the poop surrounded by an inner ring of jars and tangled masses of the catch, and an outer ring of curious scientists, pseudoscientists and seamen. No find pleased him so much as the frequent discovery of pieces of Cephalodiscus raris, of which even now there are but some 4 jars full in the world. It is as interesting as it is uncommon, for its ancestor was a link between the vertebrates and invertebrates, though no one knows what it was like. It has been a vertebrate and gone back, and now has the signs of a notochord in early life, and it also has gills. First found on the Graham's Land side of the Antarctic continent, it has only recently been discovered in the Ross Sea, and occurs nowhere else in the world so far as is known. We left Granite Harbor in the early morning of January 23, and started to make our way out. Our next job was to pick up the geological specimens at Evans Coves, where Campbell and his men had wintered in the igloo, and also to leave a depot there for future explorers. We met very heavy pack, having to return at least 12 miles and try another way. The sea has been freezing out here, which seems an extraordinary thing at this time of year. There was a thin layer of ice over the water between the floes this morning, and I feel sure that most of these big level floes, of which we have seen several, are the remains of ice which has frozen comparatively recently. 362 The propeller had a bad time, constantly catching up on ice. At length we were some 30 miles north of Cape Bird, making roughly towards Franklin Island. That night we made good progress in fairly open water, and we passed Franklin Island during the day. But the outlook was so bad in the evening, January 24, that we stopped and banked fires. We lay just where we stopped until at 5 a.m. On January 25, when the ice eased up sufficiently for us to get along, and we started to make the same slow progress, slow ahead. Stop, to the engine room, bump and grind for a bit, then slow astern, stop, slow ahead again, and so on, until at 7 p.m., after one real big bump which brought the dinner some inches off the table, Cheetham brought us out into open water. 363. Mount Nansen rose sheer and massive ahead of us with a table top, and at 3 a.m. on January 26 we were passing the dark brown granite headland of the northern foothills. We were soon made fast to a stretch of some 500 yards of thick sea ice, upon which the wind had not left a particle of snow. And before us the foothills formed that opening which Campbell had well named Hell's Gate. I wish I had seen that igloo, with its black and blubber and beastliness. Those who saw it came back with faces of amazement and admiration. We left a depot at the head of the bay, marked with a bamboo and a flag, and then we turned homewards, counting the weeks and days, and then the hours. In the early hours of January 27 we left the pack. On January 29 we were off Cape Adara, head sea, and wind, and fog, very ticklish work groping along hardly seeing the ship's length. Then it lifts and there is a fair horizon. Everybody pretty seasick, including most of the seamen from Cape Evans. All of us feeling rotten. 364 very thick that night, and difficult going. At midday, lat. 69 degrees 0 minutes south, a partial clearance showed a berg right ahead. By night it was blowing a full gale, and it was not too easy to keep in our bunks. Our object was now to make east in order to allow for the westerlies later on. We passed a very large number of bergs, varied every now and then by growlers. On February 1, latitude 64 degrees 5 minutes south, and longitude 159 degrees 5 minutes east. We coasted along one side of a berg which was 21 geographical miles long, the only other side of which we got a good view stretched away until lost below the horizon. In latitude 62 degrees 0 minutes south, and longitude 158 degrees 5 minutes east. We had a real bad day, head wind from early morning, and simply crowds of bergs all round. At 8 a.m. we had to wedge in between a berg and a long line of pack before we could find a way through. Then thick fog came down. At 9:45 a.m. I went out of the wardroom door, and almost knocked my head against a great berg which was just not touching the ship on the starboard side. There was a heavy crosswell, and the sea sounded cold as it dashed against the ice. After crossing the deck it was just possible to see in the fog that there was a great barrier berg just away on the port side. We groped round the starboard berg to find others beyond. Our friend on the opposite side was continuous and apparently without end. It was soon clear that we were in a narrow alleyway, between one very large berg and a number of others. It took an hour and a quarter of groping to leave the big berg behind. At 4 p.m., 6 hours later, we were still just feeling our way along. And we had hopes of being out of the ice in this latitude. The Terra Nova is a wood bark, built in 1884 by A. Stephen and Sons, Dundee, tonnage 764 gross and 400 net, measuring 7 feet by 1 foot times 9 foot, compound engines with 2 cylinders of 140 nominal horsepower. Registered at St. John's, Newfoundland. She is therefore not by any means small as polar ships go, but Pennell and his men worked her short-handed, with bergs and growlers all round them. Generally with a big sea running and often in darkness or fog. On this occasion we were spared many of the most ordinary dangers. It was summer. Our voyage was an easy one. There was twilight most of the night, there were plenty of men on board, and heaps of coal. Imagine then what kind of time Pennell and his ship's company had in late autumn, after remaining in the south until only a bare ration of coal was left for steaming. Until the sea was freezing round them and the propeller brought up dead as they tried to force their way through it. Pennell was a very sober person in his statements. Yet he described the gale through which the Terra Nova passed on her way to New Zealand in March 1912 as seeming to blow the ship from the top of one wave to the top of the next. And the nights were dark, and the bergs were all round them. They never tried to lay a meal in those days, they just ate what they could hold in their hands. He confessed to me that 1 hour he did begin to wonder what was going to happen next, others told me that he seemed to enjoy every minute of it all. Owing to press contracts and the necessity of preventing leakage of news, the Terra Nova had to remain at sea for 24 hours after a cable had been sent to England. Also it was of the first importance that the relatives should be informed of the facts before the newspapers published them. And so at 2:30 a.m. on February 10 we crept like a phantom ship into the little harbour of Oamaru on the east coast of New Zealand. With what mixed feelings we smelt the old familiar woods and grassy slopes, and saw the shadowy outlines of human homes. With untiring persistence the little lighthouse blinked out the message, "What ship's that? What ship's that?" They were obviously puzzled and disturbed at getting no answer. A boat was lowered and Pennell and Atkinson were rowed ashore and landed. The seamen had strict orders to answer no questions. After a little the boat returned, and Crean announced, "We was chased, sore, but they got nothing out of us." We put out to sea. When morning broke we could see the land in the distance, greenness, trees, every now and then a cottage. We began to feel impatient. We unpacked the shore-going clothes with their creases 3 years old which had been sent out from home, tried them on, and they felt unpleasantly tight. We put on our boots, and they were positively agony. We shaved off our beards. There was a hiatus. There was nothing to do but sail up and down the coast and, if possible, avoid coastwise craft. In the evening the little ship which runs daily from Akaroa to Littleton put out to sea on her way and ranged close alongside. "Are all well? Where's Captain Scott? Did you reach the pole?" Rather unsatisfactory answers, and away they went. Our first glimpse, however, of civilized life. At dawn the next morning, with white ensign at half-mast, we crept through Littleton Heads. Always we looked for trees, people and houses. How different it was from the day we left, and yet how much the same, as though we had dreamed some horrible nightmare and could scarcely believe we were not dreaming still. The harbour master came out in the tug and with him Atkinson and Pennell. "Come down here a minute," said Atkinson to me, and, "It's made a tremendous impression, I had no idea it would make so much," he said. And indeed we had been too long away, and the whole thing was so personal to us, and our perceptions had been blunted, we never realized. We landed to find the Empire, almost the civilized world, in mourning. It was as though they had lost great friends. To a sensitive pre-war world the knowledge of these men's deaths came as a great shock, and now, although the world has almost lost the sense of tragedy, it appeals to their pity and their pride. The disaster may well be the first thing which Scott's name recalls to your mind, as though an event occurred in the life of Columbus which caused you to forget that he discovered America. But Scott's reputation is not founded upon the conquest of the South Pole. He came to a new continent, found out how to travel there, and gave knowledge of it to the world. He discovered the Antarctic, and founded a school. He is the last of the great geographical explorers. It is useless to try and light a fire when everything has been burned. And he is probably the last old-fashioned polar explorer, for, as I believe, the future of such exploration is in the air, but not yet. And he was strong. We never realized until we found him lying there dead how strong, mentally and physically, that man was. In both his polar expeditions he was helped, to an extent which will never be appreciated, by Wilson, in the last expedition by Bowers. I believe that there has never been a finer sledge party than these three men, who combined in themselves initiative, endurance and high ideals to an extraordinary degree. And they could organize. They did organize the polar journey, and their organization seemed to have failed. Did it fail? Scott said no. The causes of this disaster are not due to faulty organization, but to misfortune in all risks which had to be undertaken. 9 times out of 10, says the meteorologist, he would have come through, but he struck the 10th. We took risks, we knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint. No better epitaph has been written. He decided to use the only route towards the pole of which the world had any knowledge, that is to go up the Beardmore Glacier. Then the only discovered way up through the mountains which divide the polar plateau from the Great Ice Barrier. Probably it is the only possible passage for those who travel from McMurdo Sound. The alternative was to winter on the barrier, as Amundsen did, so many hundred miles away from the coastline that, in traveling south, the chaos caused in the ice plain by the Beardmore in its outward flow would be avoided. To do so meant the abandonment of a great part of the scientific program, and Scott was not a man to go south just to reach the pole. Amundsen knew that Scott was going to McMurdo Sound when he decided to winter in the Bay of Whales, otherwise he might have gone to McMurdo Sound. Probably no man would have refused the knowledge which had already been gained. I have said that there are those who say that Scott should have relied on ski and dogs. If you read Shackleton's account of his discovery and passage of the Beardmore Glacier you will not be prejudiced in favor of dogs, and as a matter of fact, though we found a much better way up than Shackleton, I do not believe it possible to take dogs up and down, and over the ice disturbances at the junction with the plateau. Unless there is ample time to survey a route, if then. Dogs could certainly have come up as far as this, I heard Scott say somewhere under the Cloudmaker, approximately halfway up the glacier. But the best thing you could do with dogs in pressure such as we all experienced on our way down would be to drop them into the nearest chasm. If you can avoid such messes, well and good, if not, you must not rely on dogs, and the people who talk of these things have no knowledge. If Scott was going up the Beardmore he was probably right not to take dogs. Actually he relied on ponies to the foot of the glacier and man haulage on from that point. Because he relied on ponies he was not able to start before November. The experience of the depot journey showed that ponies could not stand the weather conditions before that date. But he could have started earlier if he had taken dogs, in place of ponies, to the foot of the glacier. This would have gained him a few days in his race against the autumn conditions when returning. Such tragedies inevitably raise the question, is it worth it? What is worth what? Is life worth risking for a feat, or losing for your country? To face a thing because it was a feat, and only a feat, was not very attractive to Scott. It had to contain an additional object, knowledge. A feat had even less attraction for Wilson, and it is a most noteworthy thing in the diaries which are contained in this book. That he made no comment when he found that the Norwegians were first at the pole. It is as though he felt that it did not really matter, as indeed it probably did not. It is most desirable that someone should tackle these and kindred questions about polar life. There is a wealth of matter in polar psychology. There are unique factors here, especially the complete isolation, and 4 months' darkness every year. Even in Mesopotamia a long-suffering nation insisted at last that adequate arrangements must be made to nurse and evacuate the sick and wounded. But at the poles a man must make up his mind that he may be rotting of scurvy, as Evans was, or living for 10 months on half rations of seal and full rations of ptomaine poisoning, as Campbell and his men were, but no help can reach him from the outside world for a year. If then there is no chance of a cushy wound, if you break your leg on the Beardmore, you must consider the most expedient way of committing suicide, both for your own sake and that of your companions. Both sexually and socially, the polar explorer must make up his mind to be starved. To what extent can hard work, or what may be called dramatic imagination, provide a substitute? Compare our thoughts on the march, our food dreams at night, the primitive way in which the loss of a crumb of biscuit may give a lasting sense of grievance. Night after night I bought big buns and chocolate at a stall on the island platform at Hatfield Station, but always woke before I got a mouthful to my lips. Some companions who were not so highly strung were more fortunate, and ate their phantom meals. And the darkness, accompanied it may be almost continually by howling blizzards which prevent you seeing your hand before your face. Life in such surroundings is both mentally and physically cramped. Open-air exercise is restricted and in blizzards quite impossible, and you realize how much you lose by your inability to see the world about you when you are out of doors. I am told that when confronted by a lunatic or one who under the influence of some great grief or shock contemplates suicide, you should take that man out of doors and walk him about, nature will do the rest. To normal people like ourselves living under abnormal circumstances, nature could do much to lift our thoughts out of the rut of everyday affairs. But she loses much of her healing power when she cannot be seen, but only felt, and when that feeling is intensely uncomfortable. Somehow in judging polar life you must discount compulsory endurance, and find out what a man can shirk, remembering always that it is a sledging life which is the hardest test. It is because it is so much easier to shirk in civilization that it is difficult to get a standard of what your average man can do. It does not really matter much whether your man whose work lies in or round the hut shirks a bit or not, just as it does not matter much in civilization, it is just rather a waste of opportunity. But there's precious little shirking in barrier sledging, a week finds most of us out. There are many questions which ought to be studied. The effect upon men of going from heat to cold, such as Bowers coming to us from the Persian Gulf, or vice versa of Simpson returning from the Antarctic to India, differences of dry and damp cold. What is a comfortable temperature in the Antarctic and what is it compared to a comfortable temperature in England, the question of women in these temperatures. The man with the nerves goes farthest. What is the ratio between nervous and physical energy? What is vitality? Why do some things terrify you at one time and not at others? What is this early morning courage? What is the influence of imagination? How far can a man draw on his capital? Whence came Bowers' great heat supply? And my own white beard? And X's blue eyes, for he started from England with brown ones and his mother refused to own him when he came back? Growth and color change in hair and skin? There are many reasons which send men to the poles, and the intellectual force uses them all. But the desire for knowledge for its own sake is the one which really counts, and there is no field for the collection of knowledge which at the present time can be compared to the Antarctic. Exploration is the physical expression of the intellectual passion. And I tell you, if you have the desire for knowledge and the power to give it physical expression, go out and explore. If you are a brave man you will do nothing, if you are fearful you may do much, for none but cowards have need to prove their bravery. Some will tell you that you are mad, and nearly all will say, what is the use? For we are a nation of shopkeepers, and no shopkeeper will look at research which does not promise him a financial return within a year. And so you will sledge nearly alone, but those with whom you sledge will not be shopkeepers, that is worth a good deal. If you march your winter journeys you will have your reward, so long as all you want is a penguin's egg. Glossary. Blizzard. An Antarctic blizzard is a high southerly wind generally accompanied by clouds of drifting snow, partly falling from above, partly picked up from the surface. In the daylight of summer a tent cannot be seen a few yards off, in the darkness of winter it is easy to be lost within a few feet of a hut. There is no doubt that a blizzard has a bewildering and numbing effect upon the brain of anyone exposed to it. Brash. Small ice fragments from a floe which is breaking up. Cloud. The commonest form of cloud, and also that typical of blizzard conditions, was a uniform pall stretching all over the sky without distinction. This was logged by us as stratus. Cumulus clouds are the woolly billows, flat below and rounded on top, which are formed by local ascending currents of air. They were rare in the south and only formed over open water or mountains. Cirrus are the mare's tails and similar wispy clouds which float high in the atmosphere. These and their allied forms were common. Generally speaking, the clouds were due to stratification of the air into layers rather than to ascending currents. Crusts. Layers of snow in a snowfield with air space between them. Finsko. Boots made entirely of fur, soles and all. Frost smoke. Condensed water vapor which forms a mist over open sea in cold weather. Icefoot. Fringes of ice which skirt many parts of the Antarctic shores, many of them have been formed by sea spray. Nunatak. An island of land in a snowfield. Buckley Island is the top of a mountain sticking out of the top of the Beardmore Glacier. Piedmont. Stretches of ancient ice which remain along the Antarctic coasts. Pram. A Norwegian skiff, with a spoon bow. Sennegrass. A kind of Norwegian hay used as packing in Finsko. Sastrugi. The furrows or irregularities formed on a snow plain by the wind. They may be a foot or more deep and as hard and as slippery as ice, they may be quite soft, they may appear as great inverted pudding bowls, they may be hard knots covered with soft powdery snow. Sledging distances. All miles are geographical miles unless otherwise stated. 1 statute or English mile equals 0.87 geographical mile, 1 geographical mile equals 1.15 statute miles. Tank. A canvas holdall strapped to the sledge to contain food bags. Tide crack. A working crack between the land ice and the sea ice which rises and falls with the tide. Wind. Wind forces are logged according to the Beaufort scale, which is as follows. No. Description. Mean velocity in miles per hour. 0. Calm. 0. 1. Light air. 1. 2. Light breeze. 4. 3. Gentle breeze. 9. 4. Moderate breeze. 14. 5. Fresh breeze. 20. 6. Strong breeze. 26. 7. Moderate gale. 33. 8. Fresh gale. 42. 9. Strong gale. 51. 10. Whole gale. 62. 11. Storm. 75. 12. Hurricane 92.